Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, Orbital's Green Album. Oh man guys, getting into the next discography review, and this is going to be a big one. A very big one. One so big, I don't think there's any bands out there I'm going to be talking about in as much detail as this one. And that's because Orbital, as you may or may not be able to tell from my t-shirt, Orbital are my favorite band of all time. This is the band that got me into electronic music in the first place. When I was really little, I mainly listened to like the Beatles, classic rock, cheesy 70s novelty hits, and this weird new age CD that my aunt found packaged with a shower cleaner. But once when I was in 4th grade, I was making some random crappy garage band techno songs on my uncle's computer. He told me he was going to give me a bunch of recommendations for new music to check out that he thought I would like, so he put together a CD of 15 tracks, and 4 Orbital tracks were on there. Spare Parts Express, Walk Now, Style, and Time Becomes. There were some Air songs on there too, I think I mentioned before, but I digress. That CD kicked off my journey into all things electronic music, and Orbital have become my favorite band ever since. It was so unlike anything I had ever heard at the time. These guys were consistently making songs that were often longer than 7 minutes, and for the little 10 or 11-year-old me, this was unbelievable. So spoiler alert, being the longtime superfan that I am, you can expect to see entirely positive reviews and no score on any of their main albums below the 8 range. So let's get started, shall we? The Green Album appears to be where a lot of big Orbital fans hold most of their nostalgia, as it was the period of all their iconic early singles like Chime and Satan and Belfast. It's where people who were there from the start get the most feels. But if I have to be totally honest, the Green Album is not one that I consider to be one of their higher points in their career. Of course, in a way, this is technically an outsider perspective, because my experience of Orbital in general, and especially this particular album, is a very weird one. I'm obviously only 21, and I'm American, so it's not like I was there to see Orbital's career develop. I discovered them in 2006 after they'd already broken up for the first time. We'll be getting to that. Now, if you live in America like me and you go on iTunes, you will see that the Green Album is not available there. But it was available when I was a little kid discovering the iTunes store for the first time, and they later took it down for some reason. Still up there in the UK, but I'm not from there, so I'm out of luck. I was just unlucky enough to have bought a handful of tracks from the album, only to see it removed before I got the chance to get all of them. And then after that, I wasn't able to fill in the holes until I ended up getting this CD of the Green Album here. But there's another problem in that this is the USA version of the CD, and this has a different track listing from the original UK version. So for years, I had one track missing on this album, Speed Freak, that I didn't get the chance to hear until I was a teenager. So my point is, the nostalgia factor when it comes to this album is very inconsistent. I obviously enjoy every song on this album, but there are definitely some that do it for me way more than others. And there's another thing about this album. I think in comparison with their later stuff, this album feels rather dated. Like, this album came out in 1991, and it's inextricably linked to the 90s UK rave era that was going on at the time. One of the most important releases of that era, for sure. Predates even Aphex Twin. Maybe he'd released the first analog Bubble Bath by this point. We're talking like weeks difference or something. Now, the Green Album is undoubtedly a product of its time. These songs are structured in mostly the same way and are kind of bare bones. Like, all of these have a beat that moves at like 120 BPM, I think. And they put together all these synth patterns and samples into loops, and they just kind of progress and evolve and build on each other. And while this whole loops put together formula is pretty obvious, you still end up with a fun and interesting experience every time. And this formula totally didn't end up becoming a huge influence on my own music, and especially in an obvious way on my first album, Bubble Machine. Totally not shameless plugging or anything, but whatever. Now, my nostalgia of this album allows me to forgive and look past its datedness for the most part. But there is unfortunately one song that I never really liked on here, and as you may guess, it is Speed Freak. I think a big part of it was not only did I not get to hear it until several years after it disappeared from American iTunes, and thus the nostalgia is almost non-existent compared to the other songs on this album, But in addition, the US version here replaces it with Moebius' remix of it, which is significantly cheesier and more off-putting than the original, which was already kinda cheesy. Moebius' remix always weirded me out as a kid, especially that one sample that goes and listening to that remix is especially off-putting nowadays when thinking about where Moby ended up going afterwards. I mean, granted, the same can be said about his debut album, but I'm getting off topic. I'm not a huge fan of that remix. Both Orbital and Moby are capable of better than that. But for the lowest point on the album, Speed Freak is still a pretty good song. Got no issues with the rest of the album. Like, the Moebius is a delightfully weird opener with lots of interesting and spacey percussion patterns and nostalgia-invoking Star Trek samples, even though I don't actually watch Star Trek. Ooh-La is a song that wanders around a lot, but its manic energy and sense of urgency are really engaging and fun. Desert Storm has a lot of Middle Eastern influenced melodies and textures from the weird fluty sounds and subtle sparkly chimes, and of course that catchy, intense horn hook. It does go on a bit long, stretching over 12 minutes and not having as much progression as some of the other tracks on here, but this one's still nice. But then we get to the section of the album where the nostalgia is the strongest. The next 5 tracks I bought on iTunes much more early on, so they've become longtime favorites of mine. Steel Cube Idolatry was the second song I ever bought on iTunes, like right after the live version of Halcyon from Insides. And Fahrenheit 303 came not long afterwards, like, I think maybe the 5th song I bought on iTunes? Both hold up great to this day, and super underrated tracks. Fahrenheit 303 has this great chill-out lounge kind of vibe to it with a nice vibraphone-ish hook. Some jazzy electric pianos and an outro of darker acid house synths. And Steel Cube Idolatry is obviously a bit more mechanical in tone, but still its atonal bell-like hook is an earworm. And that reversed female singing, while maybe not a choice that makes a lot of sense, helps add to that quirky atmosphere. Such a weird sounding song that, yeah, it still gives me in the feels. Love this song. And then there's High Rise, another very odd and not exactly linear song. Lots of different synth patterns that come and go alongside these elevator sound effects, and while the song meanders all over the place, all those different patterns remain memorable. The highlight being this one slowly ascending bass line. And this little high-pitched ascending riff. And there's this great section where all the synth patterns keep making key changes like you're still in that elevator going up. I guess that does kind of make this elevator music, but it's some damn fun elevator music if I ever heard it. And next is the giant elephant in the room that is Chime. Orbital's first ever single, and the one that closes out basically every single one of their live sets. Don't think a lot needs to be said about this one. The catchy and cheery melodies easily put me in a good mood, but I especially love that old-timey sample at the very end. It just gives me the feels, like, oh. This particular version is interesting, though, because it's a live version, not like that faster version they always used in their live sets. It's kind of like an edited-down version of the original, but with some occasional, like, instrumental flourishes, which would probably be off-putting if they were played in a live set nowadays, but don't feel quite as off-putting to me because I'm just used to it in the context of the album. There's no applause or anything either, it's just like an alternate mix. I distinctly remember when the Green Album was still on iTunes, they referred to it not as Chime Live, but as Chime New Version, which I suppose also works. But anyway, it directly flows into Midnight Live, which I actually prefer to the original version as it's a minute longer and a bit more clear sounding. Also, I heard this version first. Still, another super underrated deep cut. All these super dramatic, almost orchestral synth pads, these tropical tribal sequences in the middle, and stomping rock sections too. God, I love this track so much. And the album, of course, ends with Belfast, the other big single, and also that fake final ending secret track called I Think It's Disgusting. Now, Belfast, I got nothing but good things to say about Belfast. Lots of emotional moments like the Oh Yukari sample and warm synth chords and the pianos right at the beginning and all those quirky, high-pitched synth patterns. and the way the tempo slows down at the end. Perfect closer for an album like this. But the weird thing is that Belfast has never been a huge personal favorite of mine. I mean, I love Chime as much as the next guy, but Belfast would not crack my top 10. Probably not even my top 20. I mean, I still love the track and all, but I'm not sure why this song doesn't do more for me than it already does. Oh well. I will have to say though, putting this track at the beginning instead of the end, which is what the USA version does, totally the wrong move in my opinion. That track feels like an ending to this album, does not really work as an opener. And on the topic of the USA version, there's quite a bit of other track listing changes. I think I mentioned the bad ones already. The USA version of this album is really a glorified compilation more than anything. It doesn't flow nearly as well. But there are some changes in the track listing that I think are fine. The remix of Fahrenheit 303, Fahrenheit 3D3, while not as good as the original, is still pretty good. Also, this version has the 8-minute edit of Chime, my personal favorite version of that song, like by far. The USA version also has the original version of Satan, and also this intense hardcore punk influenced track called Choice, which is kinda like Speed Freak, but more intense and significantly catchier as well. Another pretty fun track there. So yeah, the USA version has better single choices, but the original UK version is undoubtedly the better album experience. And I've also heard some exclusive tracks on other different versions, like the original LP version has an exclusive track called Macro Head, which is alright, bit quirky, cheesy, silly, also kinda creepy thanks to those voice samples. There's like no nostalgia here, but it's definitely catchy at the very least. I come back to it every now and then. And the cassette version has an untitled track that is probably more fun to listen to than Macro Head. It kind of meanders around more like High Rise, but personally found it to be kind of forgettable. Probably because I discovered it so much later and never gave it that many repeat listens. So, overall, I may have my problems with the Green Album, but I still hold that it's a must-listen. You can admittedly take that with a grain of salt since I think all of Orbital's albums are must-listens, but the Green Album is worth your time mainly because it offers a fantastic snapshot of the 90s UK rave era, but presented in a way that's still easily enjoyable to this day. And on top of that, you get all these old iconic singles and some fantastic deep cuts too. It's only the beginning of Orbital's career, the stepping stone from which they built on so heavily later on, but it's one I still very much enjoy. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.